Imagine a quiet night. The world is calm, the lights are low, and history begins to whisper its stories. Tonight we travel back in time to meet a man whose life started in deep poverty, in a small wooden cabin in the wild frontier of America. A man who had almost no education, a man who failed many times, a man who often felt lonely and unsure of his future. And yet this same man would grow up to become one of the most powerful and respected leaders in history. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Most people today remember Lincoln as the tall president with the black hat and serious face. They remember the Civil War. They remember the speech about freedom. But very few people know how unlikely his story really was. He was not born into power. He was not born into wealth. He was not born into comfort. In fact, his childhood was full of hardship, danger, and uncertainty. But that is what makes his story so remarkable. Because sometimes the people who change the world are not the ones who begin life with everything. Sometimes they are the quiet children growing up, far from cities, far from schools, far from opportunity. Children who must build their future with their own hands. And Abraham Lincoln was exactly that kind of child. His story begins in the winter of 1809. At that time, America was still a young country. Large parts of the land were forests and wilderness. Roads were few, towns were small. Life was simple, but often very hard. In the state of Kentucky, deep in the countryside, there stood a small log cabin. It had rough wooden walls, a dirt floor, and a simple fireplace for warmth. The wind could slip through the cracks in the wood, and during winter the cold could be brutal. It was inside this cabin, on February 12th, 1809, that Abraham Lincoln was born. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter. He worked long hours just to provide enough food for his family. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply caring. She could read and write, which was not common for many people living on the frontier. The family was poor, very poor. They did not have books, toys, or many comforts. Their days were filled with work. Even as a small child, Abraham helped with simple tasks, gathering wood, carrying water, watching animals. But there was something different about the boy. People noticed it early. Abraham was quiet, observant, curious. He watched everything around him. The movement of animals in the forest, the changing of the seasons, the way adults spoke and made decisions. And he asked questions, many questions. Why do things happen the way they do? Why are some people rich while others struggle? Why do people argue about laws and land? For a child living far away from cities and schools, these were unusual thoughts. But Lincoln's mind was always working. The problem was that education on the frontier was rare. Schools were small and temporary. A teacher might appear for a few months and then disappear again. Children sometimes attended school only a few weeks each year. In total, Abraham Lincoln would receive less than 1 year of formal education during his entire childhood. Less than 1 year. For many people, that would have been the end of learning. But for Lincoln, it was only the beginning, because he discovered something powerful very early in life. Books. Books became his window to the world. Whenever he could find one, he read it. If a neighbor owned a book, Lincoln would walk miles just to borrow it. At night, he would sit by the dim light of the fireplace and read slowly, carefully, trying to understand every word. Sometimes he copied entire passages onto wooden boards or scraps of paper so he could remember them. He read stories, history, laws, and speeches. And the more he read, the more his mind expanded. The forests around his home were quiet, but inside Lincoln's imagination, entire worlds were opening. Meanwhile, life on the frontier continued to test the family. When Abraham was 7 years old, the Lincolns left Kentucky and moved to Indiana. The land there was wild and full of thick forests. The family had to clear trees, build shelters, and start farming from nothing. It was exhausting work. From sunrise to sunset, the family labored. Young Abraham became strong from chopping wood and working in the fields. His long arms and powerful frame would later earn him the nickname Rail Splitter, because he spent many hours cutting wooden rails for fences. But tragedy soon struck. In 1818, when Abraham was only 9 years old, his mother Nancy died from a sickness that spread through the frontier communities. Her death left a deep mark on the boy. Years later, Lincoln would still speak about her with quiet respect. He once said that everything he was, or hoped to be, he owed to his mother. For a time, the small cabin felt empty and silent. But life on the frontier did not stop for grief. There was still work to be done. Land to clear, crops to grow. A year later, Thomas Lincoln remarried. The new stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, turned out to be a kind and supportive woman. She quickly noticed Abraham's love for learning and encouraged him to keep reading whenever he had the chance. This simple encouragement would change everything, because from that moment forward, Lincoln began teaching himself constantly. He studied grammar. He practiced writing. He repeated speeches aloud to improve his speaking. Sometimes neighbors would see the tall young boy walking through the fields while reading a book. They laughed at first, but over time, people began to realize something unusual was happening. The quiet boy from the log cabin was slowly building a powerful mind, a mind that would one day guide an entire nation through its darkest hour. But at that moment, no one could imagine it. To the world, Abraham Lincoln was just another farm boy on the American frontier. And the greatest challenges of his life were still far ahead. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his teenage years, people in the small frontier communities had begun to notice something unusual about him. He was taller than most boys his age, already strong from years of hard labor, but it was not his height or strength that made him stand out. It was his mind. While other young men spent their free time hunting, wrestling, or relaxing after long days of work, Lincoln did something different whenever he had the chance. He read. Books were rare on the frontier. Many families owned none at all. But Lincoln searched for them wherever he could find them. If someone in the area owned a book, he would walk miles just to borrow it for a few days. Sometimes he borrowed a book and stayed up most of the night reading beside the weak glow of the fireplace. The next morning he would return the book carefully, often knowing large sections by heart. Neighbors began to notice this strange habit. Some thought it was amusing, others admired it. One neighbor later remembered that if Lincoln heard someone had a new book, he would appear at their door almost immediately, politely asking if he could read it. Among the books that shaped him most were stories about great leaders and thinkers from the past. He read about George Washington, the hero of the American Revolution. He read about the founding of the United States. He read about laws, government, and the meaning of freedom. Each page expanded his understanding of the world, but Lincoln did not simply read. He studied. If he found a sentence he liked, he would copy it down. If he discovered a powerful speech, he would repeat it aloud until he understood its rhythm and strength. Slowly, he began to practice writing his own thoughts, and this habit of learning on his own became one of the most important forces in his life. Life on the frontier was still difficult. The family moved again, this time deeper into the growing American territories. The land was rough, and every year demanded endless work. Trees had to be cut down. Fields had to be prepared. Homes had to be built. Lincoln worked as hard as anyone. He split logs for fences. He plowed fields. He helped neighbors build houses and barns. But even during these exhausting years, his mind never stopped searching for something more. Sometimes, after a long day of labor, he would sit quietly and think about the future. What kind of life did he want? Did he want to spend his entire life farming in the wilderness? Or could he become something else? These thoughts grew stronger as he reached adulthood. Around the age of 20, Lincoln began taking small jobs that allowed him to meet more people and see more of the world beyond the farm. He worked as a store clerk. He helped ferry travelers across rivers. He carried goods on flatboats down the Mississippi River. These journeys opened his eyes. For the first time, he saw large towns and busy trade routes. He met merchants, politicians, travelers, and workers from many different backgrounds. But one experience affected him more deeply than any other. During a trip down the Mississippi River, Lincoln visited the city of New Orleans. There he saw something that shocked him. He saw slavery. At the time, slavery was still legal in many parts of the United States. Enslaved people were bought and sold in public markets like property. Lincoln saw families separated. He saw men and women forced to stand on platforms while buyers examined them. The sight disturbed him deeply. Even though he was still a young man without power or influence, this moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. It planted a quiet but powerful belief inside him. The belief that something about this system was terribly wrong. Years later, when he became president, that belief would shape one of the most important decisions in American history. But at this point, Lincoln was still searching for his path. After returning from his travels, he settled in a small village called New Salem, Illinois. It was not a large place. Only a few dozen buildings stood along dusty streets. But for Lincoln, New Salem became the place where his life truly began to change. He found work in a local store and quickly became known as an honest and reliable young man. If customers paid too much by accident, Lincoln would walk miles to return the extra money. People started calling him Honest Abe. The name would stay with him for the rest of his life. In New Salem, he also discovered something new about himself. He loved talking with people. Evenings in the village were often spent discussing ideas, telling stories, and debating important questions. Lincoln quickly became one of the most interesting speakers in these gatherings. He could explain complex ideas in simple ways. He could tell stories that made people laugh. And when he spoke seriously, people listened. Without realizing it, Lincoln was developing one of the greatest skills he would ever possess: the ability to speak to ordinary people and make them feel understood. But his ambitions were growing. Reading books had sparked a powerful idea inside him. He wanted to understand the law. Law was not just about rules. It was about justice. It was about how a society decides what is right and wrong. So Lincoln made another bold decision. He would teach himself law. Just as he had done with every other subject in his life, he began studying on his own. He borrowed law books, read them slowly, and practiced explaining legal ideas aloud. At night, the tall young man could sometimes be seen walking outside, holding a book, and speaking quietly to himself as he tried to understand complicated arguments. People thought it looked strange, but Lincoln was preparing himself, preparing for a future no one around him could yet imagine, a future that would soon pull him into the world of politics, leadership, and national struggle. And once that journey began, there would be no turning back. Life in the small village of New Salem slowly began to change Abraham Lincoln. The more people spoke with him, the more they noticed his unusual combination of honesty, intelligence, and calm judgment. He was not loud or arrogant. In fact, many people described him as shy when he first met strangers. But when conversations turned to important questions about the future of the country, something inside him came alive. Lincoln had a gift for explaining complicated ideas in a simple way. He listened carefully before speaking, and when he finally gave his opinion, people felt that he had thought deeply about the problem. For a young man with almost no formal education, this ability surprised many. At the same time, Lincoln was still working hard to survive. The store where he worked eventually failed, leaving him with debts he could not immediately pay. But instead of running away from his problems, he made a promise to repay every dollar he owed, no matter how long it took. It would take him many years. But he kept that promise. This commitment to responsibility made a strong impression on the people around him. They began to trust him more and more. And trust, especially in small communities, can open doors that once seemed impossible. Around this time, Lincoln began to think seriously about entering politics. Politics in early America was very different from what we imagine today. There were no television campaigns, no large national organizations, and very little money involved. Local elections often depended on reputation and personal relationships, and Lincoln had already built both. In 1832, when he was only 23 years old, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. It was an ambitious decision for someone so young and unknown, but Lincoln believed that government should represent ordinary people. He believed that hard work and opportunity should be available to everyone. And he believed that the country's future depended on building roads, improving transportation, and expanding education. These ideas were bold for a young frontier politician. To campaign, Lincoln traveled through the countryside meeting farmers, workers, and merchants. He spoke with them about their problems and shared his ideas for improving the region. But his first campaign did not go as he hoped. Lincoln lost the election. For many people, this would have been the end of their political dreams. After all, he had little money, little education, and little political experience. But Lincoln saw failure differently. He treated it as a lesson. Instead of giving up, he continued studying law and building relationships in the community. He also served for a short time in the local militia during a conflict known as the Black Hawk War. Although Lincoln never fought in a major battle, the experience gave him leadership skills and introduced him to many people across the region. And slowly his reputation continued to grow. In 1834, only 2 years after his first defeat, Lincoln ran for the legislature again. This time, he won. At 25 years old, Abraham Lincoln became a member of the Illinois state legislature. For someone who had grown up in a tiny log cabin with almost no schooling, it was an extraordinary achievement. But the challenges were only beginning. The Illinois legislature met in the state capitol, which meant Lincoln had to travel long distances to attend sessions. During these meetings, he listened carefully to experienced politicians debate important issues. At first, he spoke very little. He observed. He studied how arguments were made. He watched how alliances formed. He paid attention to the small details of political life. Gradually, he began participating more actively. His speeches were clear and logical. He avoided unnecessary insults and focused on practical solutions. Other lawmakers soon realized that Lincoln had a rare quality. He was fair. Even when he disagreed strongly with someone, he treated them with respect. This earned him allies across political lines. Meanwhile, Lincoln continued studying law during every spare moment. Without attending a formal law school, he read legal books, practiced writing arguments, and slowly developed the skills needed to become a lawyer. In 1836, he officially passed the bar exam and became a licensed attorney. This moment changed his life completely. Law gave Lincoln a profession that required intelligence, discipline, and communication. It allowed him to travel across Illinois, meeting people from many different backgrounds. And it provided him with the financial stability he had never known before. Lincoln soon moved to the growing town of Springfield, which had become the new capital of Illinois. There he joined a law practice and began building a reputation as one of the most thoughtful lawyers in the region. His courtroom style was unique. Instead of dramatic performances, Lincoln focused on telling simple stories that juries could understand. He explained complex legal situations using everyday language. Jurors trusted him because they believed he was sincere, and sincerity was rare. But while Lincoln's legal career was growing, something much larger was beginning to happen across the United States. The nation was becoming deeply divided over one issue: slavery. In some states, slavery remained a powerful part of the economy. In others, it had already been abolished. As the country expanded westward, new territories had to decide whether they would allow slavery or forbid it. These decisions created fierce political arguments, and gradually the question became unavoidable. Would the United States remain a nation that tolerated slavery, or would it move toward freedom for all people? At first, Lincoln tried to focus on local politics and his legal career. But the debate over slavery kept growing louder, and eventually it would force him to take a clear position. A position that would change not only his life, but the entire course of American history. By the late 1830s, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a young man trying to find his place in the world. In Illinois, he had become known as a thoughtful lawyer and a rising political figure. He was still far from famous, but people were starting to recognize something different about him. He was tall, unusually tall for his time, standing over 6 feet 4 inches. His clothes were often simple and sometimes slightly worn. His face was long and serious, yet when he smiled it could suddenly become warm and inviting. But what people remembered most was not his appearance. It was the way he spoke. Lincoln had developed a rare ability to connect with ordinary people. He did not use complicated language or grand speeches full of difficult words. Instead, he told stories. He used humor. And he explained problems in ways that farmers, workers, and merchants could easily understand. This made him extremely popular during political discussions. When Lincoln spoke in small town halls or outdoor gatherings, people often stayed long after sunset just to hear him finish his thoughts. His voice was not powerful or dramatic, but it carried sincerity. And sincerity is often more persuasive than volume. During these years, Lincoln continued serving in the Illinois state legislature. Each year he gained more experience. Each year he built more friendships with other politicians. But one issue was becoming impossible to ignore: slavery. At the time, slavery already existed in many southern states. Enslaved men and women were forced to work on farms and plantations, especially in the production of cotton and other crops. In the northern states, slavery had mostly disappeared, but the nation was expanding westward. New territories were being created, and each one had to decide whether slavery would be allowed there. This question created intense arguments across the country. Some leaders believed slavery was necessary for economic growth. Others believed it was morally wrong and dangerous for the future of the nation. Lincoln found himself caught between these two sides. He had grown up in places where slavery existed, and he understood how deeply rooted the system was. But he also believed strongly that every person deserved a chance to improve their life through hard work. The idea that people could be owned as property troubled him deeply. At first, Lincoln spoke cautiously about the issue. He believed slavery was wrong, but he also feared that sudden changes might divide the country even more. So he focused on one key principle: slavery should not spread into new territories. This position seemed moderate at the time, but it placed Lincoln firmly within a growing political movement that opposed the expansion of slavery. Meanwhile, his legal career continued to grow rapidly. Lincoln traveled long distances across Illinois as a lawyer, often riding horseback for days to reach different courthouses. These journeys became an important part of his life. He stayed in small inns. He shared meals with farmers and travelers. He listened to people's problems and learned about their daily struggles. These experiences helped him understand the country in a way many politicians never could. He saw poverty. He saw ambition. He saw communities trying to grow and succeed. And everywhere he went, people noticed the tall lawyer who carried books with him and seemed always ready to listen before speaking. During trials, Lincoln's courtroom style was calm but powerful. He rarely shouted or attacked opposing lawyers. Instead, he carefully built his arguments step by step. Sometimes he would pause during a trial and tell a short story that perfectly illustrated the situation. The jurors often laughed, but by the end of the story they also understood his point. Many cases ended in his favor, not because he was aggressive, but because people trusted him. Trust became Lincoln's greatest strength. At the same time, his personal life was changing. In Springfield, he met a woman named Mary Todd. She came from a well-educated family and had grown up in Kentucky. Mary was intelligent, confident, and deeply interested in politics. Unlike many women of her time, she followed national debates closely and enjoyed discussing important ideas. Mary saw something special in Lincoln. She believed he had the potential to become a national leader. The two developed a complicated but powerful relationship. Their personalities were very different. Lincoln was often quiet and thoughtful, while Mary was energetic and outspoken. But they shared ambition and strong political interests. After several ups and downs in their relationship, they married in 1842. Their marriage would face many difficulties over the years. but Mary remained one of the strongest supporters of Lincoln's political future. During the 1840s, Lincoln continued building his legal career and political reputation. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1846, representing Illinois in Congress. For the first time, the boy who once studied by firelight in a frontier cabin was now working in the nation's capital. Washington, D.C. was very different from the small towns Lincoln knew. The city was filled with powerful politicians, wealthy businessmen, and intense political debates. Lincoln served only one term in Congress, but the experience gave him a deeper understanding of national politics. He saw how fragile the country's unity really was. Arguments over slavery were becoming sharper. Each year, new conflicts appeared between northern and southern states. Newspapers printed angry editorials. Politicians warned that the nation might one day split apart. After finishing his term in Congress, Lincoln returned to Illinois and focused again on his law practice. For several years, he remained mostly outside national politics. But history was quietly preparing something much larger. Across America, the debate over slavery was moving toward a breaking point. And when that moment arrived, Abraham Lincoln would be drawn back into the center of the storm. A storm that would soon test the strength of the entire nation. By the early 1850s, Abraham Lincoln was living what seemed like a stable and successful life in Springfield, Illinois. His law practice was strong. He traveled across the state handling legal cases and had become one of the most respected lawyers in the region. People trusted his judgment and admired his fairness. For a while, it appeared that Lincoln might quietly remain a lawyer and former politician, living a comfortable life far from the center of national conflict. But the country would not allow that peace to last. Across the United States, the argument over slavery was becoming more dangerous each year. The nation was expanding westward, and every new territory raised the same explosive question: would slavery be allowed there or not? In 1854, a major political decision reignited the conflict. Congress passed a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether slavery would be legal. On the surface, the law sounded democratic, but in reality, it opened the door for slavery to expand into areas where it had previously been banned. For Lincoln, this was unacceptable. He had always believed that slavery was wrong, but he also believed the nation needed time to deal with it carefully. Now he saw something that frightened him. Slavery was spreading, and if it continued spreading, it could shape the future of the entire country. This moment pulled Lincoln back into politics. He began giving speeches across Illinois, explaining why the expansion of slavery threatened the ideals on which the United States had been founded. Lincoln often reminded audiences of the words written in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. He asked a simple but powerful question: if the nation truly believed in equality, how could it allow slavery to grow? His speeches began attracting larger crowds. Newspapers started printing his words. People who had never heard of him before were suddenly discussing his ideas. But Lincoln was about to face his greatest political opponent yet: a powerful politician named Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was one of the most influential figures in American politics. He was experienced, confident, and an extremely skilled debater. He supported the idea that each territory should decide the issue of slavery for itself. In 1858, Lincoln and Douglas became opponents in a race for the United States Senate. What followed would become one of the most famous series of debates in American history. 7 debates, 7 cities, thousands of listeners gathering to hear 2 very different visions for the future of the country. The Lincoln-Douglas debates quickly became national events. People traveled long distances just to watch them speak. Some rode horses for hours. Others arrived in wagons or crowded trains. The debates were held outdoors, often lasting several hours. Douglas was confident and aggressive. He argued that the country could remain stable if each region simply decided the slavery issue for itself. Lincoln disagreed. He warned that the nation could not continue living with 2 completely different systems of freedom and slavery. During one of the debates, Lincoln spoke words that would echo across history. "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He explained that the United States could not permanently remain half slave and half free. Eventually, the nation would have to choose one direction or the other. This statement shocked many listeners. Some thought Lincoln was predicting the destruction of the country. Others believed he was speaking an uncomfortable truth that few politicians were willing to admit. The debates did not make Lincoln instantly victorious. In fact, Douglas won the Senate race. But something far more important happened. The debates made Lincoln famous across the entire country. Newspapers printed transcripts of the arguments. People in distant states read Lincoln's speeches and began to notice his clarity, honesty, and moral conviction. He was no longer just a local Illinois politician. He had become a national figure. Meanwhile, the country continued moving closer to crisis. Violence had already broken out in the Kansas Territory as groups supporting and opposing slavery fought each other. Political tensions grew stronger in Congress. Southern leaders warned that if slavery were ever threatened, they might leave the Union entirely. Many Americans feared that the nation was slowly moving toward a terrible conflict. And within a few short years, they would be proven right. In 1860, as the presidential election approached, the newly formed Republican Party needed a candidate. They wanted someone intelligent, someone respected, someone who believed slavery should not expand further. Many famous politicians hoped to receive the nomination. But something unexpected happened. Delegates began turning their attention toward the tall lawyer from Illinois, the man whose debates had captured the country's attention, the man who spoke about unity, fairness, and the future of the nation. Abraham Lincoln. And soon, the quiet boy who once read books by firelight in a frontier cabin would stand on the edge of becoming the leader of a divided country. A country that was about to face its greatest test. By the year 1860, the United States was standing on the edge of a crisis that had been slowly building for decades. The question of slavery, once debated mostly in political halls and legal documents, had grown into a deep national divide that reached into nearly every part of American life. People argued about it in homes and public gatherings. Newspapers printed long editorials defending one side or the other. Politicians delivered speeches warning that the future of the nation itself was at risk. What had once been a disagreement over policy had now become a moral and political conflict that seemed impossible to ignore. Families argued about it. Neighbors who had lived peacefully together for years sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. In some places, the disagreements grew so intense that public meetings turned into shouting matches. Across the country, people began to ask a troubling question. Could the United States survive this division? Or would the country eventually break apart? In this tense atmosphere, the presidential election of 1860 approached. It was not just another election. Many Americans believed the result would determine the future of the nation. Several candidates entered the race. Each one represented a different vision of the country's future. Some candidates represented southern states that strongly supported slavery and believed it should continue expanding into new territories. Others represented northern states where many citizens believed slavery should be limited or stopped entirely. Political parties themselves began to split apart. Old alliances broke down. New political movements appeared almost overnight. The political system that had once held the country together now seemed to be breaking into pieces. Among these candidates stood Abraham Lincoln. Just a few years earlier, he had been known mainly in Illinois, where he had practiced law and served in local politics. But the Lincoln-Douglas debates had changed everything. During those famous debates, Lincoln had spoken clearly about the dangers facing the country. He warned that the nation could not remain permanently divided between free states and slave states. His words had been printed in newspapers across the country. People who had never met him had read his arguments. They had seen his calm and thoughtful approach to difficult problems. Unlike some politicians who relied on loud speeches and dramatic promises, Lincoln spoke carefully and logically. He explained complex issues in simple language. This made many voters trust him. When the Republican Party gathered to choose their candidate, Lincoln was not the most famous politician in the room. In fact, several other men seeking the nomination were better known and had more experience in national politics. Some had served in government for many years. Some had stronger political networks and more powerful supporters. At first, many delegates expected one of those candidates to win. But Lincoln had something unique. He was trusted. Many delegates believed Lincoln could appeal to a wide range of voters. He opposed the expansion of slavery, which pleased many Northern voters. At the same time, his calm personality and moderate tone made him less threatening to people who feared extreme political change. He spoke often about preserving the Union. He warned that the country must avoid unnecessary violence. Gradually, support for Lincoln began to grow. Ballot after ballot was counted during the convention. Delegates debated and negotiated. Finally, after several rounds of voting, the delegates made their decision. Abraham Lincoln became the Republican candidate for president. Across the country, the news spread quickly. Supporters celebrated the unexpected choice. Many believed Lincoln represented a new kind of leadership. But opponents reacted with anger and fear. For many people in southern states, Lincoln represented a direct threat to their way of life. Southern leaders believed that if he became president, slavery would eventually disappear. Plantation owners worried about losing the labor system that supported their economy. Political leaders warned that Lincoln's victory could change the balance of power between North and South, and they were determined to stop that from happening. The campaign that followed was intense, but it looked very different from modern presidential elections. At that time, candidates rarely traveled across the country giving speeches themselves. Instead, supporters organized rallies and public meetings. Newspapers printed articles praising their favorite candidates and criticizing their opponents. Lincoln himself spent much of the campaign quietly in Illinois. Yet his ideas spread quickly. Supporters repeated his speeches. Newspapers printed his arguments. Political meetings discussed his vision for the country. His main argument remained simple. Slavery should not expand into new territories, and the United States must remain united. As the election approached, tension continued to rise. Some Southern leaders began warning openly that their states might leave the Union if Lincoln won. These threats alarmed many Americans. The idea that states might leave the country had been discussed before, but now it felt much more real. Finally, in November 1860, Americans went to the polls. Voters across the country cast their ballots. When the votes were counted, Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency. In the northern states, many people celebrated. Crowds gathered in cities and towns. Newspapers announced the victory with excitement. But the celebration in the North was matched by deep anger in parts of the South. Southern leaders reacted quickly. Even before Lincoln officially took office, several Southern states announced that they would leave the United States entirely. This process was called secession. One by one, states began declaring that they were no longer part of the Union. They planned to form their own nation where slavery would remain protected. For Lincoln, this was the worst possible outcome. He had always hoped the country could solve its problems through debate and compromise. But now the Union itself was beginning to break apart. When Lincoln traveled to Washington, D.C. to take the oath of office in March 1861, the atmosphere was filled with uncertainty. Some people feared he might even be attacked before reaching the Capitol. Rumors of assassination plots circulated through the newspapers. Security was unusually tight during his journey. Despite the tension, Lincoln continued forward. Finally, on March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before a large crowd at the United States Capitol and delivered his first inaugural address. The crowd listened carefully. Many people wondered what the new president would say during such a dangerous moment. Lincoln's message was calm but firm. He promised that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. But he also made it clear that the Union must remain intact. The government will not break apart, he explained. The United States, he argued, was meant to be a permanent union. No state had the right to simply leave. Lincoln ended his speech with a hopeful appeal. He asked Americans to remember that they were not enemies, but friends who shared the same country. He urged them to avoid violence and seek peaceful solutions. But even as he spoke those hopeful words, events were already moving toward war. Only weeks later, Confederate forces attacked a United States military base called Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Cannons fired across the harbor. The attack shocked the nation. It marked the beginning of the American Civil War. Suddenly, the quiet lawyer from Illinois was no longer simply a political leader. He was now the president of a nation at war with itself. The challenge before him was enormous. The country was divided. Families were divided. Even parts of the government were divided. Many people doubted whether Lincoln had the experience or strength needed to lead during such a crisis. But over the next 4 years, Abraham Lincoln would face decisions that would shape the future of the United States forever. And the greatest of those decisions was still ahead. When Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861, he stepped into one of the most dangerous moments in American history. The country was already breaking apart. Several Southern states had declared that they were leaving the United States and forming a new nation called the Confederate States of America. These states believed they had the right to leave the Union. They wanted to protect their political independence and keep slavery as part of their society. Lincoln believed something very different. He believed the United States was a permanent union of states. In his view, no state had the legal right to leave the country simply because it disagreed with an election. This disagreement could not remain peaceful for long. When Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in April 1861, the conflict that many had feared finally exploded into war. The American Civil War had begun. At first, many people believed the war would be short. Both sides expected a quick victory. Young men rushed to join armies, believing they would return home within a few months. But Lincoln quickly understood the reality. This would not be a short conflict. It would be a long and painful struggle that would test the strength of the entire nation. The United States had never faced a war like this before. Americans were now fighting other Americans. Brothers sometimes found themselves in opposite armies. Entire communities were divided. For Lincoln, the pressure was enormous. He had never served as a military commander. Many experienced generals doubted his leadership. Newspapers criticized his decisions almost daily. Some politicians even suggested he should step down. But Lincoln refused to give up. Instead, he worked harder than ever. He spent long hours studying military reports and meeting with advisors. He visited army camps to speak directly with soldiers. He wrote letters to generals, urging them to act more boldly and coordinate their strategies. One of Lincoln's greatest difficulties was finding the right military leaders. Several early Union generals were cautious and slow. They had large armies, but hesitated to attack Confederate forces. Lincoln grew frustrated watching opportunities slip away while the war dragged on. At times, he felt deeply discouraged. The casualties were rising. Battles were becoming larger and more destructive. Families across the country were receiving terrible news about sons and fathers who would never return home. Despite the darkness of the situation, Lincoln remained determined. He believed that if the Union failed, the idea of democracy itself might fail as well. The United States had been founded on the belief that ordinary people could govern themselves. If the nation collapsed, many leaders around the world might claim that democracy simply could not survive. Lincoln understood that the war was no longer only about territory. It was about the future of democratic government. Meanwhile, the conflict continued to grow more intense. Major battles began to shake the nation. At places like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam, tens of thousands of soldiers fought in brutal conditions. These battles shocked Americans who had never seen such destruction before. The war was far more terrible than anyone had imagined. Through all of this, Lincoln carried an enormous emotional burden. He read casualty reports late into the night. He visited hospitals filled with wounded soldiers. He wrote letters to grieving families whose loved ones had died in battle. Many people later said that the war seemed to age him rapidly. The lines in his face deepened, and his expression often appeared heavy with responsibility. But even during these darkest times, Lincoln was thinking about something larger than victory on the battlefield. He was thinking about freedom. As the war continued, more and more people began arguing that the conflict should not only preserve the Union, but also end slavery. Lincoln had once been cautious about this idea, but the war was changing everything. Slavery had helped create the conflict, and many believed that ending it might help weaken the Confederate States. Lincoln began carefully considering a decision that would change the purpose of the war, a decision that would move the United States toward a new definition of freedom. The moment for that decision arrived after a difficult but important battle in September 1862, the Battle of Antietam. It was one of the bloodiest single days in American history. But for Lincoln, it also created an opportunity to announce a new goal for the war, a goal that would transform the conflict from a fight for unity into a fight for human freedom. And when he made that announcement, the course of American history would change forever. By the autumn of 1862, the American Civil War had already become far more destructive than anyone had predicted. When the war first began in 1861, many people believed the conflict would end quickly. Soldiers marched off to battle with confidence, and citizens on both sides expected victory to come within months. But the reality of war proved very different. Year after year, the fighting continued. Battles erupted across fields, forests, rivers, and towns. Entire regions of the country were transformed by camps, trenches, and military movements. Thousands of soldiers had died on battlefields across the country. Entire towns had been shaken by the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. In many communities, nearly every family knew someone who had been injured or killed. For President Abraham Lincoln, every new casualty report was painful. Each day he received letters and reports describing the latest battles. Generals sent updates about troop movements and military plans. Alongside these reports came long lists of soldiers who had fallen in combat. Lincoln understood that these were not just numbers. Behind every name was a family waiting at home. Behind every casualty was a life that had been cut short. He often visited military hospitals where wounded soldiers were recovering. There he spoke quietly with young men who had survived the horrors of battle. Some had lost arms or legs. Others would carry their injuries for the rest of their lives. These visits affected Lincoln deeply. He knew that the decisions made in Washington affected the lives of countless families. But Lincoln was also thinking about something deeper. Why was this war being fought? At the beginning of the conflict, the main goal had been to preserve the Union. When Southern states began leaving the United States in 1860 and 1861, Lincoln believed his primary duty as president was to keep the country together. He feared that if states could leave whenever they disagreed with national decisions, the entire nation might collapse. But as the war continued, it became increasingly clear that slavery was at the center of the entire crisis. Southern states had left the Union largely because they feared slavery would eventually be restricted or abolished. Their economy depended heavily on enslaved labor. Large plantations relied on enslaved workers to produce cotton, tobacco, and other crops. Many Southern leaders believed their entire way of life was threatened. Meanwhile, in the northern states, public opinion was slowly changing. More and more people began demanding that the war should bring an end to slavery. Many citizens argued that the country could not truly claim to stand for freedom while millions of people remained enslaved. A growing number of soldiers also believed they were fighting not only to preserve the Union, but to create a more just nation. Lincoln understood that the conflict had reached a turning point. If the war continued without addressing slavery, the same problem might return again in the future. But if slavery ended, the nation could move toward a new definition of freedom. Still, the decision was extremely dangerous. Some Northern citizens supported ending slavery immediately. Others feared that such a move would make the war even more difficult. There were also border states that still allowed slavery, but had not joined the Confederacy. If Lincoln acted too quickly, those states might also leave the Union. Lincoln knew that whatever decision he made would change the course of the war. For months, he quietly prepared a document that would become one of the most important announcements in American history: the Emancipation Proclamation. This order would declare that enslaved people in Confederate states were to be considered free. But Lincoln waited carefully for the right moment to reveal it. He believed that announcing the proclamation during a time of military weakness might make it appear desperate. Instead, he wanted to introduce it after a Union victory. That moment came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. The battle was brutal. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day of fighting. The battlefield was filled with smoke, confusion, and terrible loss. Although the Union Army did not completely destroy the Confederate forces, it succeeded in stopping a Confederate invasion of the North. That result gave Lincoln the opportunity he had been waiting for. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced his plan. He declared that if the Confederate States did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, enslaved people in those territories would be declared free. The announcement shocked many people. Supporters of abolition celebrated the decision. Others feared it would create new difficulties in the war. When the deadline finally passed, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. With a single document, the purpose of the war expanded. The conflict was no longer only about saving the Union. It was now also about ending slavery. The proclamation had several immediate effects. First, it gave hope to millions of enslaved people. As Union armies moved through Southern territory, enslaved individuals began escaping plantations and seeking protection behind Union lines. Many risked their lives to reach Union camps. For them, the proclamation represented the possibility of freedom. Second, it allowed black men to join the Union Army. Thousands volunteered. Many believed they were fighting not only for the nation, but also for their own freedom and the freedom of others. Black soldiers would soon become an important part of the Union forces. Their bravery on the battlefield helped strengthen the Union Army during the final years of the war. Third, the proclamation changed how the rest of the world viewed the conflict. European countries, such as Britain and France, had been considering whether to support the Confederacy. Both nations relied heavily on Southern cotton for their textile industries. But once the war became clearly connected to ending slavery, it became much harder for these countries to openly support the Southern cause. Public opinion in Europe strongly opposed slavery. Lincoln understood that this moral dimension could help strengthen the Union's position. Still, the war was far from over. In fact, some of the hardest fighting was still ahead. Major battles continued across the country. Generals struggled to coordinate massive armies moving across long distances. The number of casualties continued to grow. Through it all, Lincoln remained focused on two goals: preserving the Union and moving the nation closer to freedom. Many nights he worked late in the White House. Visitors sometimes found him sitting quietly at his desk, reading military reports or writing letters. At times he walked slowly through the halls of the building, thinking about the enormous responsibility he carried. The fate of the nation rested on decisions made in that house. Yet even during these difficult years, Lincoln never lost his belief that the country could survive. He believed that the United States was more than a collection of states. It was an idea that people could live under laws that treated them fairly, an idea that opportunity could exist for anyone willing to work for it, an idea that freedom could continue to grow. But the war would still demand one final test, a test that would come in a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. And the words Lincoln would speak there would become some of the most powerful in history. By the middle of 1863, the American Civil War had already taken an enormous toll on the country. For more than 2 years, the fighting had stretched across fields, forests, rivers, and towns. What many people once believed would be a short conflict had grown into a long and painful struggle. Cities were filled with wounded soldiers returning from battle. Hospitals overflowed with men recovering from injuries suffered in distant campaigns. Families waited anxiously for letters that might bring news from the front lines. Each day, people opened newspapers with a sense of dread. The papers printed long lists of names, men who had been injured, captured, or killed. Behind every name was a story. Behind every name was a family somewhere in the country reading the news with hope or fear. The war had become a heavy shadow over the entire nation. Yet in the summer of that year, one battle would become a turning point. The Battle of Gettysburg. In early July 1863, Union and Confederate armies met in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Neither side had originally planned to fight there. But as troops moved through the region, the two massive armies suddenly collided. What followed was one of the most intense battles of the entire war. For 3 days, the fighting was brutal. Soldiers clashed across fields, hills, and narrow roads surrounding the town. Cannons thundered across the countryside. Gunfire echoed through the forests. Men charged across open fields under heavy fire. The battle seemed endless. By the 3rd day, thousands of soldiers had already fallen. Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered one final attack against Union lines. Confederate troops advanced across a wide open field toward the Union defenses positioned on a ridge. It became one of the most famous moments of the war. But the attack failed. Union soldiers held their position. When the battle finally ended, the Union Army had stopped the Confederate advance into the North. The Confederate forces were forced to retreat. For the first time in many months, the North could claim a major victory. But the victory came at a terrible cost. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The quiet town of Gettysburg had become one of the bloodiest battlefields in American history. After the fighting ended, the town faced an overwhelming task. The battlefield was filled with fallen soldiers. Many had not yet been properly buried. The smell of smoke and gunpowder still lingered in the air. Broken equipment, damaged wagons, and torn uniforms were scattered across the fields. Local citizens worked alongside soldiers to care for the wounded and bury the dead. It was clear that the battlefield needed to become a place of remembrance. Leaders decided that a national cemetery should be created at the site to honor the soldiers who had died there. The cemetery would allow families to know that their loved ones had been laid to rest with dignity. Several months later, a ceremony was organized to dedicate the cemetery. Many important guests were invited, including President Abraham Lincoln. The event was meant to honor the soldiers who had given their lives and to remind the country of the meaning behind their sacrifice. The main speaker of the day was a well-known orator named Edward Everett. Everett was famous for delivering long and powerful speeches that sometimes lasted 2 hours or more. He was considered one of the greatest speakers of his time. Lincoln was invited to attend the ceremony as well. But his role was small. He was simply asked to offer a few closing remarks after Everett finished speaking. On November 19, 1863, the ceremony began. A large crowd gathered near the battlefield. Some people stood on nearby hills to see the event. Others filled the open fields surrounding the cemetery. Many had traveled long distances to attend. They came to remember the soldiers who had fallen there. Edward Everett delivered the main speech of the day. For nearly 2 hours, he described the battle in great detail. He praised the bravery of the soldiers. He reflected on the meaning of the war. The crowd listened carefully. When Everett finished, President Lincoln stepped forward. The tall, quiet president held a small piece of paper in his hand. Most people expected another long speech. But what happened next surprised everyone. Lincoln spoke for only about 2 minutes. Yet those 2 minutes would become one of the most famous speeches ever delivered. In a calm voice, Lincoln reminded the crowd that the nation had been founded on a powerful belief, the belief that all people are created equal. He explained that the Civil War was testing whether such a nation could survive. Could a country built on freedom and democracy endure such division? The soldiers who had fought at Gettysburg, he said, had given their lives for that idea. And because of their sacrifice, the living had a responsibility. They must continue the struggle. They must ensure that the country remained dedicated to freedom. Lincoln ended the speech with words that would be remembered forever. He spoke about a new birth of freedom, and he declared that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The speech lasted barely 2 minutes. Some people in the crowd were surprised by its simplicity. It did not contain dramatic language or long descriptions, but its meaning was powerful. As the word spread through newspapers across the country, Americans began to understand their importance. Lincoln had captured the meaning of the war in just a few sentences. The country was not simply fighting to stay together. It was fighting to prove that a nation built on equality and democracy could survive. Edward Everett himself later wrote to Lincoln and said something remarkable. He told the president that Lincoln had managed to say more in 2 minutes than Everett had said in 2 hours. The Gettysburg Address became one of the most powerful statements in American history. Yet despite this moment of unity and inspiration, the war was still far from over. Battles continued. More soldiers marched into danger. More families waited anxiously for news. Lincoln knew that victory would not come easily. But slowly, the balance of the war began to change. New Union generals emerged who were more aggressive and determined. Among them was a man who would soon become Lincoln's most important military commander, General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant believed in constant pressure against Confederate forces. Instead of retreating after difficult battles, he pushed forward again and again. Lincoln admired this determination. At last, he had found a general willing to fight with the same persistence he believed the Union needed. As Grant's armies moved deeper into Confederate territory, the final stage of the war began to unfold. But even as victory slowly approached, Lincoln would soon face the heaviest emotional burden of his life. Because ending the war would require not only military success, but also forgiveness and the difficult work of rebuilding a broken nation. By 1864, the American Civil War had already lasted 3 exhausting years. When the conflict first began, many people believed it would end quickly. Soldiers on both sides imagined they might fight 1 or 2 battles and then return home. But those early expectations had disappeared. Instead, the war had turned into a long and grinding struggle that seemed to consume everything in its path. Entire regions of the country were scarred by battles. Fields that once grew crops had been torn apart by artillery fire. Forests had been cut down to build fortifications and trenches. Farms were destroyed. Railroads were damaged or completely destroyed. Towns near the fighting lived under constant fear. Families waited anxiously for letters from the front lines. Every knock on the door could bring news that someone had been wounded or killed. The war had become part of daily life. For President Abraham Lincoln, the pressure never stopped. Each morning began with reports from generals. Military officers delivered updates about troop movements, supply shortages, and the results of battles. Every day, Lincoln received new reports from the battlefield. Some carried good news, but many brought grim updates about heavy casualties and difficult conditions for the Union Army. The president often spent long hours reading these reports. He understood that behind every number was a human life. Behind every casualty report was a family waiting for news. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. At times, Lincoln felt deeply discouraged. He rarely showed these feelings in public, but those close to him could see the strain. The long war had aged him quickly. Lines had appeared on his face. His hair had grown thinner and more gray. The cheerful lawyer who had entered the presidency in 1861 now carried the burden of leading a nation at war. He knew that many Americans were beginning to question the conflict. After 3 years of fighting, patience was wearing thin. Some people in the North believed the war had already gone on too long. Others wondered whether the country might be better off negotiating peace with the Confederate States. Newspapers debated the issue daily. Public meetings sometimes turned into heated arguments. Some citizens feared that the war might never end. These doubts became especially dangerous in 1864. That year, Lincoln would face another presidential election. Holding an election during wartime was a difficult and risky decision. Some advisors suggested delaying the vote until the conflict ended. But Lincoln refused. He believed that democracy must continue even during the most difficult moments. If the United States stopped holding elections during war, it would weaken the very principles the country was fighting to defend. Still, the election created enormous uncertainty. If voters decided to replace him, the leadership of the country could change in the middle of the war. A new president might choose a completely different path. Some politicians openly argued that the Union should allow the South to separate and end the fighting. They believed peace could come quickly if the country simply accepted division. Lincoln could not accept that outcome. He believed the sacrifices already made by thousands of soldiers must not be wasted. The Union had to survive. The country had been built on the idea that states could not simply break away. whenever disagreements appeared. If the Union collapsed, the entire experiment of American democracy might collapse with it. Fortunately for Lincoln, the Union Army now had new leadership. General Ulysses S. Grant had taken command of Union forces. Grant was very different from earlier generals who often hesitated or avoided direct confrontation. Grant believed the Confederacy could only be defeated through constant pressure. He understood that the South had fewer resources and fewer soldiers. If the Union kept pushing forward, the Confederate armies would eventually weaken. Grant launched a series of intense campaigns against Confederate forces, led by General Robert E. Lee. These battles were extremely costly. Fighting raged through forests, fields, and trenches. Soldiers on both sides faced terrible conditions. Mud filled the trenches after heavy rain. The sound of artillery echoed across miles of countryside. Men fought in close combat, often under constant gunfire. But Grant refused to retreat. Each time the Confederate Army resisted, Grant moved again, forcing Lee's forces to defend new positions. This strategy slowly began to wear down the Confederate Army. At the same time, another Union general, William Tecumseh Sherman, began a campaign through the southern states. Sherman believed that destroying the South's ability to support the war would help bring the conflict to an end. His army marched through Georgia, cutting supply lines and capturing important towns along the way. The campaign was difficult and controversial, but it weakened the Confederate war effort. Eventually, Sherman's army captured the important city of Atlanta in 1864. The fall of Atlanta became a major turning point. For the first time in months, Northern newspapers carried strong news of victory. Confidence in the Union cause began to rise again. Many citizens who had once doubted the war effort now believed that victory might be possible. This success helped Lincoln greatly during the presidential election that autumn. Many voters who had once doubted him now believed that victory might finally be within reach. In November 1864, Americans went to the polls once again. Soldiers serving in the Army also cast ballots from military camps across the country. When the votes were counted, Abraham Lincoln had been re-elected as president. The result carried enormous meaning. Even in the middle of a devastating civil war, the United States had held a democratic election. The people had chosen to continue the fight for the Union. Lincoln felt both relief and responsibility. The election results showed that the nation still trusted him. But he also understood that victory had not yet been achieved. He knew the hardest work was still ahead. During his second inaugural address in March 1865, Lincoln spoke not about revenge or punishment. Instead, he focused on healing. The war had caused deep wounds across the country. Millions of people had suffered. Families on both sides had lost loved ones. Entire communities had been divided by the conflict. Lincoln believed the nation would need compassion and patience to rebuild itself. In one of the most memorable lines of the speech, he said the country must move forward with malice toward none, with charity for all. These words revealed Lincoln's vision for the future. He did not want endless hatred between North and South. He wanted reconciliation. He believed that forgiveness and understanding would help rebuild the nation more effectively than punishment. But first, the war had to end. By early 1865, Confederate armies were running out of supplies and soldiers. Union forces continued pressing forward from multiple directions. Grant's army slowly tightened its grip around Confederate defenses. General Grant's army surrounded the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. The final collapse of the Confederate government was approaching. The long and painful war was nearing its conclusion. After years of brutal fighting, the end of the war was finally near. And Abraham Lincoln, the quiet boy from the frontier who had once studied by firelight, was about to witness the victory he had struggled so long to achieve. Yet history would soon deliver a tragic and unexpected final chapter to his story. In the early months of 1865, the long and painful American Civil War was finally nearing its conclusion. For 4 years, the nation had been locked in a brutal struggle that had taken hundreds of thousands of lives. Entire landscapes had been transformed by battlefields, trenches, and burned towns. Fields that once produced crops had been torn apart by artillery. Quiet villages had become military camps. Rivers and railways were filled with soldiers moving from one battle to the next. The war had touched nearly every American family. Many homes had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Letters from the battlefield had carried both hope and heartbreak. For years, the future of the United States had remained uncertain. Yet slowly, the balance of the war had shifted. Union forces were gaining ground across the South. Confederate armies were growing weaker with every passing month. Supplies were running low, and many soldiers were exhausted after years of fighting. Food had become scarce in some southern cities. Clothing and equipment were worn thin after endless campaigns. The long conflict had drained the resources of the Confederate government. Meanwhile, the Union continued pressing forward. At the center of this final stage stood General Ulysses S. Grant and his army, which had surrounded the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Grant was determined to bring the war to a close. Unlike some earlier Union generals who had hesitated to attack, Grant believed the only way to end the conflict was through constant pressure. He kept his armies moving. Even when battles were difficult and losses were heavy, Grant refused to retreat. For months, the two sides faced each other in long defensive lines. The war had turned into a struggle of endurance. Both armies built trenches and waited for the moment when one side could no longer continue. The soldiers endured harsh conditions. Cold winter winds swept through their camps. Mud filled the trenches after heavy rain. Many men had been away from home for years. Still, they continued fighting. Lincoln followed every report carefully. Although he remained in Washington, he often visited military headquarters and spoke with his generals. He read long reports describing troop movements, supply problems, and the outcome of battles. The president wanted to understand every detail. At times, he even traveled close to the front lines, eager to see the situation for himself. These visits surprised many soldiers. They did not expect to see the president standing near the camps, speaking with officers and asking questions about the war. Those who saw him during these visits often noticed how much the war had changed him. The once energetic lawyer now carried the weight of the nation's suffering on his shoulders. His face appeared thinner, his expression more serious. The years of war had aged him quickly, yet his determination had not faded. Lincoln still believed deeply that the country could be reunited. He believed the United States was more than a collection of states. It was an idea. The idea that a nation built on democracy could survive even the most difficult challenges. In April 1865, the final breakthrough arrived. Union forces successfully captured Richmond, the capital of the Confederate government. The fall of the city marked a major turning point. Richmond had served as the political heart of the Confederacy throughout the war. When Union troops entered the city, Confederate leaders were forced to flee. Government offices were abandoned. Military commanders withdrew their remaining forces. Their ability to continue the war quickly collapsed. Only days later, on April 9, 1865, the main Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. The meeting between the two generals took place in a modest house in the village. Grant arrived wearing a simple uniform, still covered with dust from travel. Lee appeared in a clean military coat, standing tall despite the defeat his army faced. The conversation between them was respectful. Grant offered generous terms of surrender. Confederate soldiers would be allowed to return home. They would keep their horses and personal belongings. They would not be imprisoned simply for fighting in the war. Grant believed these fair terms would help the country begin healing. Lee accepted. The surrender effectively ended the Civil War. News of the event spread quickly. Across the northern states, people celebrated. Church bells rang in cities and towns. Crowds filled the streets. Flags waved from buildings. Soldiers embraced each other in relief. After 4 long years of uncertainty, Americans finally saw the possibility of peace. Many believed the country could now begin rebuilding its future. But Lincoln did not celebrate with loud excitement. Instead, he spoke quietly about the future. He understood that the end of the war was not the end of the nation's struggle. Victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. The country now faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding itself after such a destructive conflict. Southern states would need to return to the Union. Millions of formerly enslaved people would now begin their lives as free citizens. Laws would have to change. Communities would need to heal. Old enemies would have to learn to live together again. Lincoln wanted the process of rebuilding to be calm and fair. He did not believe in harsh punishment for the South. Instead, he hoped that generosity and understanding could help restore unity more quickly. He often spoke about forgiveness. He believed that the country must move forward with compassion rather than revenge. Just days after Richmond was captured, Lincoln traveled to the city himself. Many advisors thought the trip was dangerous. The city had only recently fallen under Union control. Fires had damaged large areas, and confusion still filled the streets. But Lincoln wanted to see the city with his own eyes. When he arrived, the streets were still damaged from the fighting, and the Confederate government had already fled. Yet the presence of the president quickly drew attention. When people in Richmond saw Lincoln walking through the city, many gathered around him in surprise. Some had never expected to see the Union president in their streets. Among the crowd were newly freed African Americans who had lived under slavery only weeks earlier. For them, Lincoln represented something powerful: freedom. Some people became overwhelmed with emotion. Several knelt before him. Lincoln gently asked them to stand. He told them they should kneel only before God. The moment revealed the complicated emotions of the time: relief, hope, and uncertainty about what the future might hold. For Lincoln, scenes like this strengthened his belief that the nation must move forward with compassion rather than revenge. He believed the country could rebuild itself if people showed patience and kindness toward one another. But even as the country began celebrating the end of the war, danger was quietly approaching. Not everyone accepted the Union victory. Some individuals still carried deep anger toward Lincoln and the federal government. Among them was a man who believed he could change history through a terrible act. Only 5 days after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. It was meant to be a simple evening of relaxation after years of overwhelming responsibility. A chance to rest. A chance to enjoy a moment of peace. But that night would become one of the most tragic moments in American history. Because while the nation was beginning to breathe again after the long war, a shadow was already moving toward the president. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington, D.C. felt lighter than it had in years. For a long time, the capital had lived under the heavy shadow of war. Soldiers moved through the streets. Government officials worked late into the night. Newspapers were filled with reports from distant battlefields. But now something had changed. News of the Confederate surrender had spread quickly across the country, and many Americans believed that the long nightmare of the Civil War was finally coming to an end. For the first time in 4 years, people felt that peace might truly be possible. In the capital city, the mood was different from anything seen during the war. People filled the streets, talking, laughing, and celebrating the return of peace. Flags waved from windows and balconies. Groups gathered outside restaurants and taverns, sharing stories about the long years of conflict. Some soldiers who had been stationed in Washington joined the celebrations. Others simply walked quietly through the streets, enjoying the rare feeling of calm. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed hopeful. President Abraham Lincoln had carried the weight of the war on his shoulders for 4 difficult years. Every major decision had passed through his hands. Every battle report eventually arrived at his desk. The constant reports from battlefields, the long nights of decision-making, and the endless pressure of leadership had left him exhausted. Friends and advisors could see how much the war had changed him. His face had grown thinner. Deep lines had appeared across his forehead. Even his posture sometimes showed the burden he carried. Yet in the final weeks of the war, those close to him noticed something new. A sense of quiet relief. The conflict that had threatened to destroy the country was finally ending. Friends and advisors encouraged him to rest whenever possible. They believed the president deserved time away from constant work and responsibility. That Friday evening, Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. It would be a simple evening, a chance to relax. The performance was a popular comedy called Our American Cousin, and many people believed it would be a pleasant distraction after the long strain of the war. Word quickly spread through Washington that the president would attend the performance. At the time, the presence of the president at a public event was an exciting occasion. Many citizens hoped to see him in person, even if only for a brief moment. Crowds gathered outside the theater hoping to catch a glimpse of him as he arrived. Inside, the theater was bright with gaslight. Rows of lamps illuminated the stage and audience. The seats quickly filled with people dressed in their evening clothes. The atmosphere was cheerful. People chatted with friends and waited for the comedy to begin. Ford's Theater itself was a popular place in Washington. The building was elegant but comfortable, with several levels of seating and private boxes overlooking the stage. One of these boxes had been prepared especially for the president. Lincoln arrived shortly after the performance had already begun. As he entered the theater, many members of the audience noticed him immediately. Whispers moved quickly through the crowd. "The president is here." When Lincoln stepped into the balcony box reserved for him, the actors paused briefly, and the audience rose to their feet. Applause filled the room. Lincoln smiled and bowed slightly in response. It was a simple gesture, but it showed his usual modesty. For a few moments, the atmosphere felt peaceful. The war was ending. The country was celebrating. And the president was enjoying a rare evening away from his work. But in another part of the theater, a man was already preparing a terrible plan. His name was John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a well-known actor. In fact, he had performed at Ford's Theater many times before. He came from a famous acting family and was recognized by many theatergoers. But Booth also carried strong political beliefs. He was a passionate supporter of the Confederate cause. The Union victory had filled him with anger and bitterness. Booth believed that Lincoln had destroyed the Southern way of life. In his mind, the president deserved punishment. Over the previous days, Booth had begun planning an attack on Lincoln. Because he was an actor, Booth knew the layout of the theater extremely well. He understood where the hallways were located. He knew the entrances and exits. He knew which areas were usually guarded and which were not. This knowledge made his plan possible. Late in the evening, as the play continued and the audience laughed at the actors on stage, Booth quietly entered the theater. He moved through the building carefully, avoiding attention. Step by step, he approached the hallway leading to the presidential balcony. Inside the box sat Lincoln, his wife Mary, and two guests. They were watching the performance, smiling occasionally at the jokes in the play. None of them realized what was about to happen. Booth reached the door of the balcony. Inside the theater, the audience was focused on the stage. The moment he had been waiting for had arrived. Booth entered the box and raised a small pistol. A single shot rang out. At first, many people in the audience did not understand what had happened. Some thought the sound was part of the play. Others turned their heads toward the balcony in confusion. But within seconds, the truth became clear. Lincoln had been struck. Booth then leapt from the balcony to the stage below. As he landed, he shouted a phrase before quickly escaping through the back of the theater. The audience erupted into chaos. Some people screamed. Others rushed toward the stage. Many simply stood frozen in shock. Panic filled the room. Doctors in the audience immediately rushed forward to help the wounded president. They examined his injury and quickly understood the seriousness of the situation. Moving him through the crowded streets would be difficult and dangerous. Instead, they decided to carry him to a nearby house directly across the street from the theater. Carefully, they lifted Lincoln and carried him outside. The small house belonged to a local tailor. Inside, the doctors placed the president on a bed in a narrow bedroom. There, under dim light, they worked through the night. Members of the government soon arrived and gathered quietly in the house. Cabinet members, military officers, friends. They waited in silence, hoping for any sign that the president might recover. But the wound was too severe. Through the long night, Lincoln remained unconscious. Early the next morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The news spread rapidly across the country. Only days after celebrating the end of the Civil War, Americans now faced a new shock. The president who had guided the nation through its darkest years was gone. People across the North mourned deeply. Church bells rang in sorrow. Black cloth appeared in windows and on public buildings. Thousands gathered in silence as the story of the assassination reached every town and city. Even many in the South, who had once opposed Lincoln, recognized the tragedy of the moment. The war had ended, but the man who had fought so hard to preserve the Union would not live to see the rebuilding of the country he loved. And in that quiet bedroom across from Ford's Theater, the life of one of America's most important leaders had come to an end. When the news of Abraham Lincoln's death spread across the United States, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Only days earlier, the country had been celebrating the end of the Civil War. Crowds had gathered in the streets with music, flags, and hopeful speeches about the future. People believed the long nightmare was finally over. After 4 exhausting years of war, families imagined a time of peace. Soldiers were preparing to return home. Cities were planning celebrations. Newspapers spoke about rebuilding the nation and starting a new chapter. But everything changed in a single moment. The news moved from city to city with shocking speed. President Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Now the mood changed completely. Shock turned into grief. The excitement that had filled the streets only days earlier disappeared. Conversations became quiet. People stopped what they were doing to read the latest news posted in shop windows or printed in newspapers. For many Americans, Lincoln had become more than a political leader. During the long years of war, he had come to represent stability, determination, and a quiet kind of moral strength. Even those who had once doubted him now understood how much responsibility he had carried. He had guided the country through its most dangerous crisis. And now, he was gone. Church bells rang across cities and small towns. Newspapers printed black borders around the headlines announcing the president's death. People gathered in silence outside government buildings and public squares. The nation was mourning. In Washington, Lincoln's body was placed in the White House so officials and members of the public could pay their respects. Long lines formed as people slowly walked past the coffin. The line moved quietly. Some visitors removed their hats as they entered the room. Others stood still for a moment before moving on. Many wept openly. Soldiers who had survived the war stood quietly, with their heads bowed. Some still wore worn uniforms from the battlefield. Mothers held the hands of children who had never seen the president, but had heard his name, spoken with respect for years. Many people could not believe that the man who had led the nation through such darkness would not live to see the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. Soon preparations began for one of the most remarkable funeral journeys in American history. Lincoln's body would travel by train from Washington, D.C. back to Springfield, Illinois, the city where he had lived before becoming president. Springfield was where he had built his career as a lawyer. It was where many of his friends still lived. And it was the place he had once called home. But the journey would not be direct. Instead, the train would follow a long route through many of the major cities, where Lincoln had once spoken during his political career. The idea was simple: allow the people of the country to say goodbye. The funeral train began its slow journey north. Black cloth covered the train cars. Flags hung at half-staff. Soldiers stood guard as the train moved from station to station. As the funeral train moved slowly across the nation, enormous crowds gathered along the tracks. People waited for hours. Sometimes entire towns stood silently beside the railway lines just to watch the train pass by. Even those who could not see the coffin still wanted to be part of the moment. They wanted to show respect. They wanted to say farewell. In New York, thousands filled the streets as the coffin passed through the city. Buildings were draped in black cloth. Churches opened their doors so people could gather for prayer. In Philadelphia, people stood in line for hours just to enter the building where Lincoln lay in state. Some visitors traveled from distant towns simply for the chance to walk past the coffin. The same scenes repeated again and again. In each city, people waited patiently for their turn to pay their respects. Some stood silently, others placed flowers nearby. Many simply looked at the coffin for a moment before quietly stepping aside for the next visitor. For many Americans, this was not just the death of a president. It felt like the loss of someone who had helped carry the country through its darkest years. Historians later estimated that millions of Americans saw the funeral procession or the train during its journey. For a country that had just endured years of war, the loss of Lincoln felt deeply personal. Many believed he was the one leader capable of helping the nation heal. Without him, the future felt uncertain. When the train finally reached Springfield, Illinois, the city where Lincoln had once practiced law and built his early career, the mourning reached its final moment. Thousands gathered for the funeral. People who had known Lincoln personally stood beside those who had only heard his speeches or read his words in newspapers. He was buried in a cemetery not far from the places where his life as a young lawyer and politician had begun. It was a quiet resting place, far from the noise of Washington, far from the battlefields that had once filled his thoughts. The boy who had grown up in a small log cabin on the frontier had traveled an extraordinary path, from poverty to the presidency, from self-taught student to national leader, from unknown lawyer to the man who guided the United States through its most dangerous crisis. And although his life had ended suddenly, his influence was only beginning to grow. Because in the years after his death, Americans continued reflecting on the decisions he had made. They remembered how he had preserved the Union when the nation was breaking apart. They remembered how he had moved the country toward ending slavery. They remembered the quiet strength he showed during the darkest moments of the Civil War. His speeches continued to be read, his ideas continued to be discussed, and his life story continued to inspire future generations. Slowly, Abraham Lincoln became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol of perseverance, a symbol of leadership during crisis, a symbol of the belief that a nation built on freedom could survive even its most difficult challenges. And his story offered another important lesson: that greatness does not always begin with wealth, education, or power. Sometimes it begins in the most ordinary places, in a small cabin, in a borrowed book, in the quiet determination of someone who refuses to give up. Lincoln's journey from a frontier childhood to the presidency became one of the most powerful stories in American history. And even today, long after his time, that story continues to remind people that even the most ordinary beginnings can lead to extraordinary impact. After Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Springfield, the United States entered a new and uncertain period. The Civil War had ended, but the country still faced enormous challenges. The fighting had stopped, yet the damage left behind by 4 long years of war could be seen everywhere. Cities had been damaged or burned, railroads had been destroyed, fields that once grew crops had become battlefields. Millions of families had lost fathers, brothers, and sons. The nation had survived, but the cost had been extremely high. Now the United States had to begin the slow process of rebuilding. The work ahead would be difficult. Southern states needed to repair their towns and farms. Roads and railways had to be rebuilt so trade could begin again. Governments in many places had to be reorganized. At the same time, millions of people who had once lived in slavery were now beginning entirely new lives as free citizens. For generations, they had lived under a system that denied them freedom, education, and opportunity. Now they faced a future that was both hopeful and uncertain. They needed schools. They needed protection under the law. They needed opportunities to work, own land, and build families without fear. The country had to learn how to move forward after years of conflict. And that would not be simple. Lincoln had hoped to guide this difficult process himself. During the final months of the war, he had already begun thinking about the future. He understood that winning the war was only the first step. Rebuilding the nation would require wisdom and patience. He had spoken often about rebuilding the country with fairness and understanding. He believed that both the North and the South would need patience and forgiveness if the Union was truly going to heal. Lincoln did not want a future built on revenge. He believed harsh punishment would only deepen old wounds. Instead, he imagined a future where former enemies could slowly learn to live together again under one government. He spoke about moving forward with malice toward none and charity for all. These words showed the kind of future he hoped to build. But after his death, others had to continue that work, and the path forward proved far more complicated than many had hoped. Even so, Lincoln's ideas remained powerful. Many Americans looked back at his speeches and decisions for guidance. They remembered the calm way he spoke about unity. They remembered how he resisted calls for revenge against the South. His example continued to influence how many people thought about rebuilding the nation. Instead of punishment, Lincoln had imagined a future built on reconciliation. One of the most important parts of that vision involved the freedom of formerly enslaved people. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared many enslaved individuals free during the war, but Lincoln understood that stronger legal protection would be necessary to end slavery permanently. Without stronger laws, the old system might return in different forms. Before his death, he had strongly supported a constitutional amendment that would abolish slavery across the entire United States. This would make freedom permanent. In January 1865, only months before the end of the war, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. This amendment officially ended slavery in the United States. For the first time in the nation's history, slavery was completely forbidden under the Constitution. Although Lincoln did not live long enough to see it fully ratified by the states later that year, his leadership had helped make the moment possible. The decision marked a turning point in American history. A system that had existed for centuries was finally abolished. Over time, Americans began to recognize how much Lincoln's decisions had shaped the nation's future. Historians studied his speeches carefully. Students learned about his life in schools. Teachers told the story of the boy who grew up in a small log cabin and became president during the country's greatest crisis. Writers and artists created books, paintings, and monuments in his honor. One of the most famous memorials to Lincoln stands today in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial. The building is large and quiet, built with tall white columns that resemble the architecture of ancient temples. Inside the monument sits a large statue of Lincoln, seated quietly in a chair. He appears thoughtful and serious. His expression reflects the enormous responsibility he carried during the Civil War. Visitors from around the world walk through the memorial each year. Many stand silently for a moment. Some look up at the statue. Others read the words of Lincoln's speeches carved into the walls. Among them are the words from the Gettysburg Address, the short speech that reminded Americans why the war had been fought. Those words continue to echo across generations. They remind visitors that democracy depends on the dedication of its citizens. The memorial does not celebrate Lincoln as a perfect man. Instead, it honors the courage it takes to lead during times of crisis. Lincoln faced criticism throughout his presidency. Some people believed he moved too slowly against slavery. Others believed he moved too quickly. Newspapers often attacked his decisions. Political opponents sometimes questioned his ability to lead the country. But Lincoln never allowed fear of criticism to stop him from acting according to his principles. He believed leadership required patience. He believed it required humility. And he believed it required a willingness to listen carefully to others. He often spent long hours meeting with advisors, generals, and ordinary citizens who wanted to share their concerns. Perhaps that is why his story continues to inspire people today. Lincoln's life proves that greatness does not always begin with wealth or privilege. Sometimes it begins in quiet determination. Sometimes it begins in the simple decision to keep learning. A boy reading borrowed books by the light of a fireplace. A young man walking miles just to return money that did not belong to him. A lawyer telling simple stories in small courtrooms across Illinois. A politician speaking honestly to ordinary people about difficult problems. Step by step, those small moments built the character of a leader who would eventually guide a nation through its darkest chapter. And because of that journey, the name Abraham Lincoln has become one of the most respected in history. His life reminds us that leadership is not always about power. Sometimes it is about patience. Sometimes it is about integrity. And sometimes it is about the quiet belief that a country can become better than it once was. Even today, long after his time, that belief continues to inspire people around the world. As the years passed after Abraham Lincoln's death, the United States slowly began to rebuild itself. The Civil War had ended, slavery had been abolished, and the nation faced the enormous task of healing wounds that had taken generations to form. The war had changed everything. Cities had been damaged. Families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Entire regions of the country had been left struggling to recover. The Union had survived, but the cost had been incredibly high. Rebuilding the nation would take time, and patience, and wisdom. The process was not easy. Communities across the country had to learn how to live together again after years of deep division. People who had once seen each other as enemies were now expected to share the same towns, the same markets, the same government. Families who had once stood on opposite sides of the battlefield were now citizens of the same nation once more. In some places, the tension remained strong. Old arguments did not disappear overnight. Memories of loss and suffering were still fresh in the minds of millions. But slowly, step by step, the country began to move forward. New laws were written. Freed people began building new lives. Schools, farms, and businesses slowly returned. And through all of these changes, the memory of Abraham Lincoln remained present. People spoke about him often. They remembered the calm way he spoke during moments of crisis. They remembered how he tried to hold the country together when it seemed impossible. And they remembered the quiet determination that carried him from a small frontier cabin all the way to the presidency. Lincoln's life had never followed an easy path. In fact, his story was filled with hardship long before he ever entered politics. He had known poverty as a child. His family lived in simple wooden cabins on the American frontier. Life there was difficult and uncertain. Every day required hard physical work just to survive. There were no comfortable schools nearby, no wealthy relatives, no powerful friends who could open doors for him. Instead, Lincoln had to create his own opportunities. He had experienced repeated political defeats as a young man. He had lost elections. He had struggled with debt. He had faced moments when his future seemed unclear. Many people would have given up after those early failures, but Lincoln did not. He kept moving forward, even when progress was slow, even when success seemed far away. Later, as president during the Civil War, he faced enormous criticism. Newspapers attacked his decisions. Political opponents questioned his leadership. Some people believed he was acting too slowly. Others believed he was acting too boldly. No matter what choice he made, someone disagreed. Yet through each challenge he continued working. He continued learning. He continued listening. And he continued believing that the United States could survive its greatest trial. In many ways, Lincoln's story is not simply the story of a president. It is the story of a person who believed that effort, honesty, and patience could change the course of a life. His childhood offered very little opportunity. He had almost no formal education. Historians often note that Lincoln attended school for less than 1 full year in total during his youth. But that did not stop him from learning. Whenever he found a book, he read it. If a neighbor owned a book, Lincoln would borrow it and read it carefully, sometimes late into the night by the light of a fireplace. He studied language. He studied history. He studied the law. Slowly, piece by piece, he built his education on his own. There were no powerful connections waiting to help him, no wealthy supporters guiding his early career. But he refused to accept that those limits defined his future. Instead, he built his knowledge piece by piece. A borrowed book, a long walk to return a debt, a careful argument in a courtroom, a thoughtful speech before a small audience. Each step prepared him for responsibilities far greater than he could have imagined. And when the moment arrived, when the country faced its greatest danger, Lincoln was ready to lead. His leadership was not loud or dramatic. He did not try to appear powerful. He rarely used complicated language. Instead, he focused on understanding people. He listened carefully. He spoke slowly. And when he addressed the nation, he tried to explain difficult problems in simple, honest words. This quiet style of leadership became one of his greatest strengths. People trusted him. Even those who disagreed with him often respected the sincerity behind his decisions. During the Civil War, that trust helped hold the nation together during some of its darkest days. Even today, more than a century later, Lincoln's words continue to appear in classrooms, books, and public discussions about leadership and democracy. Students study his speeches, historians analyze his decisions, writers reflect on the lessons of his life. The Gettysburg Address remains one of the most studied speeches in history. In only a few short sentences, Lincoln explained the meaning of the Civil War and the importance of preserving democracy. The idea of a government of the people, by the people, for the people continues to shape how many nations think about freedom and responsibility. Those words still echo through time, and the image of Lincoln himself, tall, thoughtful, and determined, remains a symbol of perseverance. A reminder that leadership is not always about strength or power. Sometimes it is about patience. Sometimes it is about humility. And sometimes it is about holding firmly to a belief even when the world around you seems uncertain. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Lincoln's story is how ordinary it began. No one looking at that small log cabin in Kentucky in 1809 could have predicted the future that waited there. No one could have guessed that the child growing up inside would one day guide a divided country through its most painful war. No one could have imagined that the quiet boy reading borrowed books would one day deliver words remembered across centuries. Yet history often grows from unexpected places. Sometimes it begins with a quiet child who asks questions. Sometimes it begins with a young man who refuses to stop learning. And sometimes it begins with a single person who believes that a nation can be better than it is. That belief shaped the life of Abraham Lincoln. And even now, long after his time, the story of that belief continues to inspire the world. Because Lincoln's journey reminds us of something simple but powerful. Great change does not always begin with power. Sometimes it begins with curiosity. Sometimes it begins with persistence. And sometimes it begins with a person who refuses to stop believing that the future can be better than the past. The